is subverted in the place of God. We have a human thirst for power, the human love of aggression and violence, human dominance, and we have a different kind of tale being told in that city. And so for us, as believers, as us as people of faith who come and commit our lives to Christ, the questions that we have to ask are: how do we live as part of God's city? How do we live as part of Zion? How do we live as part of a reality where we acknowledge Jesus as King? And it is more than just an acknowledgement with our mouth, but a declaration with our lives. And that's really the difficult part. This morning, the working title is A City of Truth and Enemy Love. And so we're dealing with a huge concept this morning. And when I saw the title, City of Truth, I was kind of a bit struck, because I've had a peculiar relationship with truth in my life. I don't know if any of you have ever been on a faith journey to find the capital T truth of Christianity. I say capital T truth sarcastically. I have, and I've shared a little bit of this before with you, but I was raised as Roman Catholic. I did a lot of my studies at a Catholic university. I spent a huge portion of time in a Baptist church, and now find myself in a Church of Christ church with strong Anabaptist influences. And I teach in a Pentecostal charismatic college, so I'm incredibly confused all the time when it comes to the Bible and theology and how to begin to approach it. And so I've wrestled for a really long time trying to figure out, well, what is the truth? What is right? What is wrong? What is good? What is bad? What's left? What's right? What is the right way to approach the scriptures? What is the right way to pray? What is the right way to talk about our faith? What's the right way to live our faith? And there's people who come with these kind of dual ways of interpreting life. And I struggled, I wrestled, I still do, all the time. But I remember a moment in my life when I was wrestling so profoundly that I was actually unable to really do anything. I was part of a church setup, I was preaching at the time, and struggling to figure out, well, if I don't know what is right, if I don't know what the truth is, how can I serve? How can I participate? How can I speak? How can I lecture, by the way? How can I begin to try and tell other people what this truth is? And it was really a crippling experience for me. And many of you probably would have been there, trying to find that capital T truth. And then I was hit one day with a scripture that I'd heard a billion times before. But it began to come alive inside of me, and what it began to do was bring me a sense of peace. And what that scripture was, many of you would have heard before, is a passage in John where Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And what I began to realize is perhaps the truth that I was searching for was not necessarily an understanding that I was supposed to come to, but a person that I actually should follow. It was a different way of thinking about it. It was a different way for me to begin to frame my search, my quest for truth. Instead of this capital T truth, this understanding that I was looking for, this right method of thinking, this right method of acting, I realized that the truth actually came to us in the form of a man. And in order to find that truth, we need to look to him and begin to try and follow it. So that's what we're doing in this series. We're trying to follow Jesus in a way that acknowledges truth as not just something that you speak, but truth as something that you live. You see, there's many people who speak the truth in a way that invalidates the truth in their life. I've done it many times before. And that's the hardest thing about being a Christian, is you can say all the right things in the wrong way, and you said the wrong thing, if that makes sense. It probably doesn't. For many of you, though, you have been there in that moment when I was like, I know I'm right, but I said it in a way that was hostile, or in a way that was aggressive, or in a way that was arrogant, invalidating everything that I stood for, invalidating everything that I carried. And so the truth that we're searching for this morning is not a truth that you conclude, it's a truth that you live. And we're going to be looking, and I apologize in advance this morning. This morning we're going to look at the text in a really meticulous way. We're going to zoom in. Instead of zooming out and having a look at a broad landscape, we're going to zoom in and get really messy in trying to understand what's going on. The text that we're dealing with, if you're following along, is in Matthew 5, verses 33 to 48, right? Like a lot. And so we're going to break it down into three separate chunks. The first chunk, most of us would have engaged with before, is talking about oaths, making an oath, telling the truth. How to let your yes be yes and your no be no. The second part is that strange passage where it says, talks about eye for eye, tooth for tooth, and Jesus is kind of flipping on its head, doing some strange things with like slapping people's faces and stuff. And then the third part is love your enemies, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense unless we have the first two to precede it. And so we're going to look at it in a particular way. And what I want to do is I want to frame it I want to give us a tool for being able to read the Sermon on the Mount that we're going to carry with us for the next few weeks. And so what we do here, I apologise, is going to be probably a little bit of a challenge. It's just going to be slow. But this will set us up hopefully for the next few weeks. Because what I want to do is I want to change the way that we approach the Sermon on the Mount so that we can actually begin to bring out some really powerful and transformative truths, so that we can begin to not just speak the truth, but we can begin to live the truth. Because I don't want us to continually get caught in a search for truth that has no lived experience. Because the reality of Christ is that when you begin to live like Him, the truth just begins to flow. So how do we stop getting caught in the endless cycle of words and actually begin to live the experience? And so a lot of people, when they approach the Sermon on the Mount, they approach it from a particular way. I'm using Miles' phone, it keeps locking. We're gonna do this. A lot of people approach the Sermon on the Mount like this. Okay, you've heard this language before, Jesus using it. He says, "You have heard it said, but I am telling you." You've heard that in the Sermon on the Mount? Continually, relentlessly, Jesus is saying, "You've heard it said, but I am telling you." This, the technical term, is a dyadic structure. Di meaning two. So it's a twofold structure. It's a way of looking at the text through two different lenses. And the two different lenses are where Jesus is speaking about the original meaning, "You have heard it said," and He's giving you a different one. "Now I'm telling you." Is that easy to understand? That's a dyadic structure. That's the way of saying, Jesus is saying, here's what you thought you knew, and here's what I'm telling you now. It's kind of, the way it's often interpreted is actually two ways. Either Jesus is saying, you've got the old way, and I'm giving you the new way. There's problems with that, because it would seem that He would be erasing the old way, which we know He didn't do, because He went on to say, not one letter of the old way is going to fall down, so it's really confusing. Another way that's often interpreted is He's saying, here's the old way, and I'm making it harder. Right? You've heard it said, do not murder. I'm saying don't even be angry. And you're like, oh my goodness. Like that, I was struggling with that. But this is too much for me. And so those two ways of interpreting it are the most common. Also the most challenging. Because the first way of interpreting it requires you to pretty much forget the Old Testament. It's like more than half of the book. Okay, I'm uncomfortable leaving that behind. The second way, however, is the most problematic. Because if what Jesus is saying is here, you thought it was hard, I'm here to make it so much more difficult. It can become intoxicating. It can become restrictive. It becomes, for lack of a better word, legalistic. We simply live in order to abide to sets of principles, sets of rules, a way of being. And so what we're going to do this morning is give you an alternative way of interpreting it. Instead of a dyadic structure, we're going with a triadic structure. For those of you who are struggling to follow along, that's 3. So this is a different method of interpretation. You're going, which one's right? We've just broken that down. It's not about right and wrong. It's about living Jesus as well. So the first phase of the triadic structure is Jesus saying, you have heard it said. What's going on? Rotating. The second stage is Jesus saying, but I am telling you. And the third, the cheeky third stage, is what you need to do is this. This is a lived experience. Let's flesh it out a little bit more. See, the first stage of the triadic structure is the traditional language, the traditional piety, the traditional understanding that anyone who was listening to him would have been able to understand quite easily. You've heard it said this, and they're like, yeah, I have, every week at church. Then he goes, hang on, but I am telling you. But what he does in that second stage, when he says, I am telling you, is he's not giving them necessarily a framework for which to begin to act. He does that later. He begins to give them examples of how their traditional understanding had got them caught in a perpetual cycle of the destruction that they represent. We're going to give you some examples in a minute. And then the third thing that he does is he says, okay, what you need to do is this. And this is where he begins to speak about transformation. This is where the life of Jesus begins to come into sort of real fruition. And he begins to give us this way out of a vicious cycle that is perpetuated by this law that doesn't really make any sense. Okay? Have you ever, maybe this is like I said, we're going to get really close and really messy with the text. And this is maybe a little bit much. Maybe let's break it down. Have you ever had a moment where you've done something that you knew probably wasn't right? Or it didn't make you feel good in terms of faith, whatever it is. I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, because you get more. And your response to that was to clean up your act. Like, you know what? I'm going to pray. I'm going to be the best damn prayer anyone has ever seen. I'm going to pray every day. I'm going to clean this thing out. And you kind of overcompensate your sinfulness or your brokenness or your fragile nature with this kind of overarching declaration. I do it all the time with exercise, okay? I really want to exercise, I want to run. I went for a run this morning. So I get to a stage where I'm like feeling unhealthy, and I go, you know what, I'm going to exercise. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to do a 5k run every single morning. And I build myself up, and I even talk about it to people before I've even done it. I'm like, I'm exercising. Well, I'm thinking about exercising. I'm going to be exercising. I kind of overcompensate for the fact that I've just eaten like 12 donuts the day before. But the problem with that is that my overcompensation really starts to kick in when I'm about 500 metres into my 5 kilometre run, and I'm like having blackout spells of nausea and kind of doubled over. And all these other people are just kind of looking at me. I was there this morning by the beach. But have you ever done that? In some phase of your life, you try to overcompensate something by saying, I'm going to do this really well. But what you end up with is something that was worse. You end up kicking yourself in the foot, because now I've tried to exercise, it's all fallen apart, I feel worse about myself, so I slip straight back to where I was before and make myself feel better by eating 15 donuts instead. It's a vicious cycle. The threat is real. And so what Jesus is doing is he is offering me a way out of that perpetual cycle. Maybe for some of you it's bigger than that. I can't see how, but maybe for some of you it's more. But as we begin to go through the scriptures, particularly the ones this morning, I want us to look at it through this lens. I want us to see, first of all, the traditional understanding. What is he highlighting in their own understanding that is bad, that is negative? But how do they get caught in a cycle? Maybe trying to fix that negative understanding. Maybe trying to be better. Maybe trying to be good. But what they're doing in order to try and be good is the same destructive things that they were doing that was leading them to be bad, in very crass, simplistic terms. And what is Jesus doing? Is he's saying, look, let's just acknowledge that and leave it to the side. And here's an alternative way. And that's really the crux of this morning, is what is that alternative way for each and every one of us to live? Because the gospel represents an alternative way. It represents a way that you've never even thought of living before. In every situation you come to, Jesus is neither giving you the opportunity to sit back and just let life happen, nor is he giving you the opportunity to hit life with all you've got. He's giving you an opportunity to follow him, and through that lived experience, you become a part of his kingdom, his reality, his Zion in a very real sense. So let's get to the point. Most of you are asking me to do that already. The first passage is called Telling the Truth. Let's read it. Matthew 5, starting in verse 33. Again, you have heard it said, do not break your oath, but fulfill to the Lord the vows that you have made. But I tell you, so you hear that structure? I tell you, do not swear an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is God's throne, or by the earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. And do not swear by your head, for you cannot make even one hair white or black. All you need to say is simply yes or no. Anything beyond this comes from the evil one. That's a little bit harsh. So let's take this passage and let's have a look at it in light of the structure that we've just talked about. Okay? So, verse 33. Again, you've heard it said to the people long ago, do not break your oath, but fulfill to the Lord the vows that you have made. So he's talking about their traditional understanding of the law. Okay? In the Jewish imagination, they would be listening to this going, this is the law. Okay, this is reflected in Leviticus, this is reflected in Deuteronomy, this is reflected in the book of Numbers. It will be in their heads, they will be understanding. Okay? Makes perfect sense. He goes on to say, but I tell you, do not swear an oath at all. Which sounds like a strange thing to say. You ever made an oath to someone? Like a promise? Like a double promise? Like a cross your heart, hope to die promise? little insight. If you have to add layers of promises, like double promise, probably means they don't trust you in the first place. It's true, right? I promise. Oh, he promises promises. He never breaks his promises. See, what was happening, the context of this, is the particular oaths that they would make, okay, particularly the Pharisees, because this is a particular indictment against the Pharisees, where they would basically make an oath, a vow, about to keep the law, about to keep friendships, about to keep covenant relationships. But the vows that they would make were less about actually keeping the promises, and more about letting everyone know that you were making a vow. Right? It was a big show, a big song and dance. And they would gather everyone together, offer sacrifices, wear fancy clothes, proclaim it to the rooftops that we're going to make a vow, we're going to make an oath, we're going to keep the oath. But they had no intention of actually making the oath. They just wanted people to see them making an oath. Because when people can see you doing something that looks pious, that looks holy, that's all that really matters. As long as you can keep the fact that you actually failed from them, they'll forever think that you're holy. That's the catch, isn't it, of Christianity? Like, you can do all the right things that makes you look beautiful, and as long as you don't reveal your brokenness, they'll never know. It's one of the beautiful... I love Phil's preaching, and one of the reasons I love Phil's preaching is because he's very confessional. And to be honest, in my own life, I find that exceptionally difficult to let you in, to be confessional, to be vulnerable, to actually bear my brokenness. I find it difficult enough to do with my wife, let alone you guys. And that's the same for many of us, I think. But one of the realities of what's going on here is Jesus is hitting out at a particular practice where he's saying you don't even care about whether you keep your promises. You just want everyone to know that you're making them. It makes you look better. So what is his alternative? Well, his transforming way, his third way, is why don't you just let your yes be yes, and your no be no. Don't swear by the heavens or swear by the earth. Don't swear by your head or Jerusalem or the temple. None of these are actually yours to swear by. Why don't you just say yes and let that mean yes? Or say no if it's no. I know, it's revolutionary. But difficult, right? Is it difficult? Has anyone actually found it difficult? I find it difficult because I have the memory of a clownfish. And so oftentimes my yes is actually a no, not because I'm being Pharisaical, simply because I've booked 3 things in my calendar. But every time I have a calendar clash, I feel really bad because I have this resounding in my head like, you should just say no. I should really just check my calendar, shouldn't I? But it's trickier than you think. The reality of just allowing your yes to be yes and your no to be no is actually a very revolutionary principle in our own lives if we begin to apply it. And we begin to see why it becomes so revolutionary as we track through it, okay? Because telling the truth, truth-telling, being people in society and in the world that can begin to speak the truth powerfully and profoundly is one of the greatest gifts that we have. Because one of the questions is if we, as people of faith, as people trying to live the gospel, don't tell the truth, if our yes is no and our no is yes, how on earth are people going to come into this space and trust us when we talk about Jesus? And that's part of the problem, isn't it? That so often, and many of you have had that experience, even an experience of faith, where someone's been talking to you about the capital T truth, and later on you've realised that the experience doesn't match the proclamation, and there's an inconsistency there. And so that's why the point in this section is that people may come to know the truth when we commit to telling the truth truthfully. Makes sense, right? Telling the truth truthfully is highly important. Okay? Coming to understand the scriptures is one thing. Coming to see Jesus as the truth is another. And speaking that truth truthfully is another thing entirely. There are so many people who really love Jesus and who really love the Gospels and who really teach powerfully and profoundly, but they do it in a way that leaves you feeling violated, that leaves you feeling oppressed, that leaves you feeling rejected, leaves you feeling outcast. Have you ever had that experience? You've listened to someone speak and you felt worse about yourself. Now, the goal of preaching is not to make you feel better about yourself necessarily, but to challenge you with the image of Christ. But you know that experience when you had a conversation with Christians or with someone about faith, and it was less about Jesus and more about them. So that's what I realised about my own journey with truth, is that it was less about Jesus and more about me. If I could have the truth, then I'd be able to tell you the truth. And you'd be like, oh, John knows the truth. And that would be wonderful. So it's me being professional. So let's move on, because this is a rolling story that builds up. The second passage is all about resisting evil. Let's have a little bit of a look. Starting in verse 38 of the same chapter. You have heard it said, now we're thinking, we're like, original meaning. You've heard it said, eye for eye and tooth for tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. If anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. Now, many of you have actually dealt with this text quite extensively, so if you have done this before, forgive us as we indulge it for a little bit. But let's just have a look. Again, we're going to go back. I told you it's a little bit repetitive. Let's impose this onto our preformed triadic structure. Verse 38, the traditional piety, the traditional language. You've heard it said, eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Okay? This is within that common language. If someone takes something from you, take something from them. If someone hits you, hit them back. Make sense? But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. And when you do some textual study in that particular passage, what you realize the interpretation is, it's not just do not resist an evil person, it's do not resist an evil person using evil means. Okay? Do not resist that person who is inflicting evil upon you by inflicting evil upon them. Bad idea. Martin Luther King begins to ring in our head. Do not fight evil with evil, because what do you end up with? Evil. The problem is that you now just become evil. Do not fight violence with violence or hate with hate. Why? Because you end up with the same thing that you use to try and make it better. And so this is the vicious cycle here that we are oftentimes caught up in ourselves. It's why we, as Christians, don't engage with gossip. It's why we talk about violence in such a negative way, because you cannot fight evil with evil. And he knew this. Verse 39, the second half, he proposes a transforming initiative that really began and begins to highlight for us both the power and the difficulty of the gospel. Because the transforming way here, the alternative way, is he said, if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. Saying, if someone is forcing evil or violence on you, turn the other cheek. Now, this is a really common thing to say, turn the other cheek. And what I find in my own experience is that people, when they're talking about turning the other cheek, they really, again, have a look at it through a dual lens, the dialectic structure, okay? Either turning the other cheek is your way of being passive and apathetic in the face of violence, right? Just turn the other cheek and let them go for it on the other side, right? Doesn't sound that fun, to be honest. But if some of you actually tried it, you've been hit with logo. Just go again. Nice idea. It's not going to work. Okay, sorry. The other side of that is people say, well, that can't be what he means. Because if he's really talking about kind of resisting the evil person, or, what are you going to do? You're going to hit him back. Yeah? Someone hits you, what do? You hit him back. I was watching a gangster movie the other day called Black Mass. Has anyone seen it? No, you shouldn't watch it. There's a guy teaching his son gets into a scrap on the schoolyard. He's like, why? Did you get in trouble? He's like, I got in trouble because I hit him back. He's like, no, you got in trouble because you got caught hitting him back. You need to do it when no one can see. And the mum's like, no, this is terrible news. And I'm like, yeah, this is terrible. Why? Because if you hit him back, he's going to hit you back, and it's going to turn into a fight. Jesus is beginning to propose an alternative here. But the alternative is not to simply resist by being apathetic and standing back. You see, the dialogue here is really fascinating, and it's built on contextual understandings of which hand was appropriate to hit you with. There was one particular hand that wasn't appropriate to hit someone with, because you did something with that hand that you didn't really want to use it for anything else afterwards. They didn't have Kleenex or, what is it like? Toilet paper. Yeah, they didn't have that. And so there was a particular hand that was off limits. Okay, so you didn't hit people, you didn't shake hands, you didn't hug besties and wipe hand people's faces or anything like that. You used your right hand, okay? But when you were speaking to a servant, someone who was less than you, someone who was servile, the way you'd hit them is you'd hit them with a backhand slap, okay? Like, okay, because that's more degrading than actually hitting someone front on the face. If you wanted to hit someone who's an equal to you, just punch them straight in the face. If you want to make someone feel demeaned, just give them a little. Yeah, the imagery right. The whole concept of turning the other cheek is a defensive maneuver. Saying if you turn the other cheek, you're facing a side of the. It's hard for me to do this without someone coming up. I don't want to hit Phil. So we'll just go with the imagery, practice it when you get home. When you turn the other cheek, you actually force them to stop slapping you as a slave and start engaging with you as an equal. Okay? This is the entire story. This is the same story as go the extra mile. Going the extra mile within this passage is highlighting a particular and degrading, humiliating practice that the Romans would inflict on the Hebrews. So if they were riding along and they saw a young Hebrew man and they wanted to humiliate him in front of his family, in front of his peers, they would get off their horse, take all the stuff that was on their horse and put it on this guy. And they would force him to walk with them 1 mile. Okay? They were only allowed to do 1 mile by the law because they didn't want to be too humiliating. But Jesus, in saying go the extra mile, is saying you have to go that 1 mile. And that 1 mile you'll walk, you'll be humiliated. You'll be a slave. You'll be dehumanized in front of everybody. But the moment you take an extra step, you're no longer bound by the law. The moment you take an extra step, you take that step as a slave. Not as a slave, but as a free man. The moment you take that extra step, it's no longer them humiliating you in a very real way. You are now humiliating them. And so what would often happen is the Romans, for fear of breaking the law, they would get off their horse and start pleading with the Hebrew. Drop it! Please! Please! Give me a hand putting it back on my horse, I'm really sorry. And it elevated the status of the slave back up to an equal. It's the same with giving your coat. I won't go into that, but the same way, giving of your coat was a way of exposing the system that actually led to your poverty and allowing them the opportunity to invite you into their conversation as an equal. So turning your cheek, giving your coat, going the extra mile are all invitations from Jesus to neither be apathetic in the face of evil, nor to be violent as a response to violence, but to offer them, the ones perpetrating the evil, the opportunity to treat you as an equal and therefore be redeemed and restored. I talked about this in a class a few weeks ago, and someone, and I apologise if I've shared this before, I can't remember, but one of the people in the class said, well, that's all well and good, but my son is being bullied at school. And this was a conversation that happened really over 3 or 4 weeks in classes, and she said, so my husband is teaching him to fight. Because when people are beating down on him, asking for money or just trying to humiliate him, I don't want him to just be humiliated in front of his friends. So my husband's teaching him to fight. So are you telling me that he has to just take it? He said, well, that's like really hard, right? I said, well, the reality of that situation is that you're proposing only 2 alternatives, only 2 ways. Accepting the beat down or becoming the bully. And which one is better in that system? Which one would you rather be? Which one reflects Jesus in that system? Neither of them, because both of them just perpetuate a vicious cycle. I said, have you ever wondered why he is beating down on your kid? Like maybe he goes home every night to an alcoholic father who beats down on him, and the only way he knows how to express himself is through violence. Maybe your son has an opportunity to be the one who asks him that question when no one else will. And I understand that. It seems a little bit naive. I understand maybe it's a bit idealistic. But at the same time, if the gospel doesn't compel us to ask the questions that nobody else asks, then what does it do? If the gospel doesn't invite us into a way of living that is completely counterintuitive to the rest of society's narratives, then what does it do? Whenever I talk about this, people always give me, and it's always students, like, the smart students, they always give me a situation. They're like, well, what if someone broke into your house, right? And they had your wife at gunpoint. You have 2 choices. You can kill them, or let them kill your wife. What would you do then? Well, really backed me into the corner with a tiny analogy. But it's the same thing, isn't it? It's like, well, you've assumed that there are only 2 choices. There is always another choice. That is exactly what the gospel is. Another choice. Another way. A third way. Okay? I don't have the choice to either be violent or be apathetic. I have the choice in that moment to respond like Jesus would do, and not just look for the redemption of the one that I love, but also look for the redemption of the one perpetrating the evil and the violence. And this is the reason we have these conversations. Because we exist in a society that continues vicious cycles of violence, of hatred, of aggression, of persecution. And if the gospel doesn't become an interruption to that, then I don't know what it's good for. And the way it becomes an interruption to that is that we must begin to ask these kinds of questions and look for the redemption not just of the ones being persecuted, but of the ones actually persecuted. I always have that image of the Roman centurion at the bottom of the cross after he's seeing Christ crucified, and he said, surely this is the Son of God. What happened in that moment? It wasn't Jesus' exuberance and brilliance. He wasn't looking his best and his most powerful. He was bleeding out, hung to a cross. And it's in that moment that he said, well, something really happened. How do we begin to live that kind of story? And that, to be honest, sucks. Because I don't know, some of you have experienced immense pain in your life, immense trauma, immense abuse. Some of you have been victims of systems that have stripped you of your dignity, of your wealth, of your authority, of your power, whatever it is, and have left you feeling crippled, alone, and empty. And the gospel not only invites you into a story where you can begin to experience His grace, but it then asks you to find ways to bring grace to the ones who left you feeling like that in the first place. Because that's when everything becomes new again. And that's hard. Jesus' alternative way of resistance restores even the one doing the evil. We have to move on to the last portion of the scriptures, and we'll try and power through this one. Loving your enemy. Hopefully this makes a bit more sense now. Because to be honest, loving your enemy is kind of like, okay, I've just got to remember to do that, right? Love your neighbour, cool, awesome. I mean, that's difficult most of the time. But love your enemy. Oh. Yeah, it's meant to do that. I don't know what's going on. Let's read Matthew 5, verse 43. You've heard it said, love your neighbour and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. He causes the sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. See, if you love those who love you, what reward will you get? Are not even the tax collectors doing that? If you greet only your own people, what are you doing more than others? Don't even the pagans do that. Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect. Can you flick to the next slide for me, please? Can I do it? Okay, great. So again, final time we're going to use this chart. If you hate charts, just close your eyes and pretend it's some oil painting. Verse 43. You have heard it said, love your neighbour and hate your enemy. That's the traditional language. Love your neighbour and hate your enemy. It's actually difficult enough to do this, right? Have you ever had those neighbours? Yeah? Those family members? Those friends? Not easy. It's hard enough to love those that you're supposed to love, right? To love those who actually have no inclination or no willingness or no intention of loving you back is also exceptionally difficult. And this is the way they traditionally understood it. Well, we'll love the ones who love us back. Why? Because there's a reciprocation here. At least at times we're going to feel better about ourselves. And then Jesus, highlighting the vicious cycle, says, well, if you love those who love you, what reward are you going to get? What reward are you going to get by simply loving the ones who are going to love you back and hating the ones who will hate you back? Where is the break in the cycle? Can you imagine that in our society? If we just loved the ones who were lovable and hated the ones who were different to us? Imagine what the world would be like. It would be filled with violence. It would be filled with hatred. It would be filled with corruption. Can't imagine. The alternative is to love your enemies and to pray for those who persecute you. This is one of the questions in the small groups this week. This is probably one of the most profound questions. Is when have you seen this or experienced this in your own life? When have you seen or experienced someone praying for the very one who was actually persecuting them. Not just praying for deliverance from the situation, but praying that the person perpetrating such evil, such abuse and such violence, that they would actually experience God's grace at the same time. And that perhaps they would experience God's grace through you. Because that's our vision for society. That's our political statement. The gospel is our politic. And the gospel is a way of saying all of those who are corrupt and who are violent, who are evil, we could just try and get rid of them. It would be like Barabbas. We resisted violence with violence. But what we could do is bring those people into the fold and let them experience such grace that it transforms their experience, their life, their perspective. I mean, the amount of testimonies that I've heard of people who were there and who've been brought back and it's powerful. Ever heard someone? I mean, look at the disciples, tax collectors. You know, literally, the equivalent of a tax collector is a Jew working for the Nazis during World War II. Not loved, not respected, hated. But to pray for them was dangerous. To look for their grace and their redemption exposed you to their evil. And that's part of it, isn't it? Let's flip to the last slide. See, loving your enemy is to tell the truth truthfully in a way that brings restoration for everybody. There is no boundaries to God's grace. There is no boundaries to our love. There is no boundaries to our welcome. It is the alternative way of the gospel story to live like this. To tell the truth in a way that reflects not just the right way of thinking, but the right way of living. To bring an alternative way by neither being apathetic nor by being violent, but by being redemptive. And finally, to love even those who are out to get you. And we're going to finish the service today with a prayer that we pray every week. That we love even those who don't like us. And perhaps that statement will now come into sharp focus for us this morning, as we remember that there are and there will always be people that don't like us. There will always be people who persecute you. There will always be people out to get you. And the gospel offers you no relief from that necessarily, but it offers you the opportunity to engage that in a way that brings grace. And that, again, is difficult. I keep saying it's difficult. So that is the framework for interpreting the Sermon on the Mount. And there are 14 triadic cycles. 14. We've dealt with 3 of them today, and there are more to come. And so as we begin to look through the lens of what Jesus is teaching on the Sermon on the Mount, we're going to be looking for that third way, that alternative way, that neither allows us to sit back nor allows us to be violent, but a way that actually allows us to experience God's grace and then to bring God's grace. And it's going to be exceptionally difficult for all of us if what we do is take it home and go, how can I live that? How can I experience the truth by actually living it in my life? But I pray that all of us would struggle profoundly, that we'd lose sleep, that we'd go slightly crazy in the search for living and experiencing the truth of Jesus. So let's pray. Lord, I thank you so much for, again, the honour that it is to come before you today. I confess myself that a lot of the things that we're talking about I find so challenging every day and fail every moment of every day in my attempts to be like this. But I'm so thankful for your grace that catches me in the moment that I fall. Your grace that brings healing, grace that allows me to experience love, but then challenges me to extend that love beyond just what I've experienced. And live an alternative way, a third way. Amen. We are going to do communion call now, but I haven't got it. So I'm going to hand over to Phil.